We are talking stage 3 tax cuts, and before your eyes glaze over, this affects millions of you, but perhaps not until 2024. But at the moment, Labor is contemplating tinkering with them because they're about to hand down its first budget. There's pressure from all sides to wind this back. There has been an argument that these tax cuts disproportionately affect the so-called rich. Let's discuss this more with independent MP and federal member for North Sydney, Kylea Tink. We haven't spoken to you since our Sky News debate, so great to have you here on set. What is your position on the stage 3 tax cuts, first of all?
Well, to me, I think this is a conversation that we shouldn't be having right now. The reality is I think it's a distraction for us. You know, Australians are feeling the pinch of the cost of living right now with the fuel excise being reapplied and inflation rates increasing. I think any discussion around this issue at this point in time is simply meaning that we're not talking about the discussion we should be having, which is where are the other sources of potential revenue for the Australian government. So things like the multinational tax rate, things like windfall profit taxes. That's where the short-term revenue opportunity lies. And so, yeah, I think it's somewhat, it's just a distraction, an unnecessary distraction. As you said, this is 2 years away. We don't know where we're going to be in 2 years' time, so let's focus on the here and now.
It's interesting as well because we've seen that budget consolidation as well, an extra $50 billion, and it must be uncomfortable for you to see that extra money going into budget coffers, and largely this is from commodity exports, coal, gas, those types of things. How does that sit with you?
Well, I think we have a real issue in terms of how revenue is generated in our country at the moment. 70% of the revenue that our government relies on is either coming from personal income tax or company tax. So it's like we're trying to drive a four-wheel vehicle on two wheels. We need to find and unearth other sources of revenue for our nation. I think you look at something like the pharmaceutical sector is a really great example. You know, in the year of 2021, despite the fact that that sector had profits of around $24 billion, only $2 billion of that was deemed taxable. So the sector paid around about $400 million in tax. I'm not an accountant, but that doesn't make sense. You know, the federal government invested nearly $14 billion in our PBS program and we got $400 million back. So there are other sources of revenue for our government, and I think the fact that we keep falling back in on this conversation about individual taxes, it's just self-defeating, and it shouldn't be the conversation we're having right now.
But also, you know, the budget heavily relies on coal and our coal exports.
I think, well, that's where we get back to the resources taxing. And the reality is that when you look at a lot of those companies and businesses that are involved in that area, they're actually not paying the rates of tax that we need them to. We live on royalties when it comes to resources, not taxes. Okay. And I think that is one of those areas. When I talk about a windfall tax, they're the areas. It's resources, it is coal, it is gas, it is pharmaceuticals, it is tech companies. There's a lot of businesses making a lot of money out of Australia at the moment, and because they're not necessarily based here, we're not seeing that flow through to our bottom line. Interesting,
just going back to the income tax cuts at stage 3. I mean, it benefits those earning between $120,000 and $200,000 a year. For your constituents, probably paying a really high mortgage, you know, they're paying higher groceries like everyone else in the country. I mean, where do you draw the line as rich? You know, we've seen from some economists, some Greens, some in the unions saying these tax cuts would be grossly unfair. I imagine many people in your electorate on that wage would not be seeing this as grossly unfair, would they?
Well, I think it's actually not just my electorate. I think it's our country, you know, and I noted this morning Michael Friedlander coming out and talking about his community out in Camden. You know, these people in this price bracket are actually the people who are usually got heavy mortgages. They're paying to get their kids into childcare centres. They're desperately trying to juggle all sorts of other fees and costs and petrol costs. So I think it does our nation a disservice to describe these people as rich. They're not. They may be well off, but they're not rich. They're not the super rich that, you know, we see others talking about. So again, for me, this comes down to what's happening in our society right here and right now. How can we drive our revenue generating capacity forward in a constructive way? And then as we move forward through the next 12 months, the next 18 months, let's look at what's happened with inflation. Let's look at what's happened with average earnings, because who knows what in 2 years' time the people occupying that wage bracket might be looking like?
Well, we know that bracket creep is only getting worse. So in 2 years' time, in 2024, is it, in your mind, more acceptable for Labor to look at it and look at winding it back? I mean, for example, if we're in the inflationary environment in 2 years that we're in now, which they don't predict, by the way, perhaps there is more of an argument to look at this, but right now there's not?
I think it's definitely, right now this is not the discussion we need to be having. And I think, to your point, Laura, we should address the matters we can address as they come into our immediate time frame. So yes, in 2 years' time, I'd be happy to look at this, look at the environment and see what's happening. I would say, if we've learnt nothing over the last 2 years, is that it's incredibly difficult to predict where any of us are going to be or what the world's going to look like. So put that discussion aside. We don't have time to have that discussion. The discussion we need to be having right now is around windfall profits and how we make sure our Australian government gets a fair share of those.
If Labor does decide to do something with these stage 3 tax cuts in this upcoming budget, how do you think your electorate will react?
Look, I think that my electorate would be bemused because this is, to do something in the next budget would actually be drawing that all forward by a period of time which was never discussed. I come back to the point, this was discussed as a reform for 2024. Leave it in 2024. Let's get on with doing what we need to do in the next 2 years and then assess it as we come into that last 6 month period.
Kylea Tink, great to talk to you. We'll have you on the show again soon. See you soon.